Okay. I couldn't believe it. What you do can be interesting. Depends. Some of them is pretty stressed. Get one first. Some students use it well. Your Korean study. The prime is about growing up. And they are it's supposed. Because that's
It's like there's a lot. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and just start. Okay. Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the second event of the Rethinking Korea Speakers Series. I am Philip Tai, Director of the Northeastern University Global Asian Studies Program and Associate Professor of History and Asian Studies. I want to very much welcome you here and very much thank you for coming. The Rethinking Korea Speakers Series is made possible by the South Korea Initiative Fund, which was established earlier this year by a very generous donation from the Min family. The gift, I hope, will not only help create an institutional presence for Korean studies here at Northeastern, but also offer scholarships to students, Northeastern students, who wish to study or work in Korea, and also help support the hiring of a Korean language instructor, which I'm sure many students are looking forward to. I believe that more attention on Korea at Northeastern could not have come at a more opportune time, given the growing importance of Korea in our modern world. And we hope that programming like this speaker series will kickstart some very much needed and long overdue conversations within the Eastern community. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for this series. Now, before I introduce our speaker, please allow me a moment to acknowledge the many people and supporters who made this series possible. I want to thank once again the Min family for their generous donation. I want to thank Michelle Davis at the University Advancement Office for originally securing this support. I also want to thank my many colleagues here at Northeastern and the Global Asian Studies Program. And a lot of professors have done considerable work behind the scenes in supporting this series. I also want to thank our many co-sponsors, including the Departments of History, Philosophy and Religion, and International Affairs, as well as the Northeastern Humanities Center and the Center for the Arts. And finally, I want to thank our wonderful staff who made this event possible, Caitlin McPhee, Jian Yao Yu, and Mika Morikawa Joe. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker this afternoon. Hajin Jun is the James B. Palais Assistant Professor of Korean History in the Department of History and the Jackson School of International Study at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on the history of modern Korea, the Japanese Empire, and Christianity in East Asia. Her current book project examines the politics of ritual reform in early 20th century Korea. He explores how marriage, funerary, and ancestral rites became heated sites of contestation as Protestant leaders, Korean cultural nationalists, and Japanese colonial officials sought to realize disparate visions for the Korean people, as well as for the proper place of religion in modern society. The place of religion in modern society is an ongoing topic, very important. Prior to joining the University of Washington, Hajin Jun received her PhD in history from Stanford University, which I heard is a pretty good school. And she received a BA in history and political science from the University of Michigan. Her talk this afternoon is entitled Problem Kin, Ritual Reform and Wartime Mobilization in Colonial Korea. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Jun.
Thank you, Philip, for that really kind introduction. And thank you all so much for being here on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. I'm really grateful to the Global Asian Studies Program, the Min family, as well as the mini campus sponsors who have made this visit possible. It's really a privilege to be a part of the Rethinking Korea lecture series. So as Philip mentioned, our discussion today draws from my ongoing book project that explores the politics of ritual change in Korea under Japanese colonial rule. And just to get everyone on the same page, to be super clear, a little bit of tech difficulty. Should we bring it closer? I think maybe the
Is it on?
is on. It's not on the signal possibly. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Sure.
Oh, is it the left? Yeah. Perfect. Sorry about that. So by rituals, certainly I'm not talking about all rituals that we can possibly think of. I'm actually really talking about a very specific subset of rituals. And this is really Confucian family rites. I'm talking specifically about weddings, funerals, and ancestral veneration. And during the Joseon Dynasty, which spanned 1392 to 1910, these ceremonies were really important. They were crucial for disseminating Neo-Confucian moral values, and they were also crucial to structuring a Confucian society. And my book and our talk today is really thinking about how during the period that followed, so the period of Japanese colonial rule, which spanned 1910 to 1945, these very same Confucian family rites were becoming political lightning rods for diverse groups like Protestant communities, Korean cultural nationalists, and even the Japanese colonial state. So I'm really excited to share a really brief snippet of my research with everyone here today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation afterward as well. So on July 11, 1935, the Korean newspaper, the Dongailbo, reported an unusual incident that took place at a funerary ceremony in North Gyeongsang, which is a province in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula. A local family called the Ans were hosting a traditional Confucian funeral ceremony called Sosang. And this Sosang ceremony typically took place on the first death anniversary of the deceased, and it would usually gather relatives from near and far to pay their respects to the dead. But when guests arrived at the An family home, they were actually greeted by completely unfamiliar faces. 4 county officials stood at the outer gate of the home, and they were screening guests. And it turned out that all but the closest kin would be turned away without even so much as a greeting to the chief mourner. And these shunned funeral guests complained bitterly about their treatment. Many of them had traveled several days to be in attendance. But the county officials simply said that they were doing their job. Well, Korea at the time was actually in the midst of war mobilization. During the years directly preceding this An family funeral, really pivotal historical events set into motion empire-wide preparation for war. In 1931, Japan invaded Northeast China, an event that later became known as the Manchurian Incident. And in the following year, in 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo was established, wholly in defiance of international critiques against Japan's territorial expansion. And so further military conflict with China appeared imminent, and Korea became an increasingly important foothold for Japan in continental Asia. And so then Governor General Ugaki Kazushige, who was at the apex of the colonial state at the time, really wanted to make sure that Koreans would be able to be mobilized for war. And the transformation of Korean ritual customs emerged as one of Ugaki's signature policies. On November 10, 1934, the government general promulgated what was called the Guidelines on Ritual Practice. And this exhaustive manual instructed Koreans on how to modify their existing weddings, funerals, and ancestral veneration. That is 3 of the 4 Confucian rites of passage that we just talked about. And this text, the guidelines, really represented quite an unprecedented move on the part of the colonial state. Throughout the 1910s and 20s, the first 2 decades of Japanese rule, officials actually largely did not intervene in Korean ritual practices. And it was actually Koreans themselves, whether members of these fast-growing Protestant communities or iconoclastic cultural nationalists, who were spearheading the earliest initiatives for changing these ritual practices. But with the promulgation of the guidelines, the government general insisted that these intimate details of Koreans' ritual life, so when to get married, how to mourn loved ones, where to commemorate ancestors, all of these were now the purview of the colonial state. And to this end, the guidelines brought government agents to the very doorsteps of ordinary Koreans like the An family. So scholars have really grappled with how to make sense of this text. There's not that many sources that are available to us. And there's myriad prescriptions on how exactly Koreans should be performing their rituals. And prevailing interpretations have largely fallen into 2 camps. Some historians were emphasizing the material dimensions of colonial rule. So from this perspective, officials were really trying to simply economize Korean practices, and these traditional ceremonies would become part of a broader lifestyle of modern colonial subjects. And other scholars have looked at the guidelines through the lens of cultural violence. And from this perspective, the rhetoric of economization was simply a convenient pretext to swap out Korean traditions with Japanese counterparts. So my research certainly builds on the important contributions of these earlier works. But that said, I actually don't think that existing interpretations actually fully explain where exactly the guidelines on ritual practice fit into Korea's broader ritual landscape, or its role in colonial wartime mobilization. And I want to say that by paying attention to both of these aspects, we can actually trace how Confucian ritual practices, Confucian ideas and practices, and family rites in particular, would actually become critically important to the government general. I want to say that colonial officials didn't simply seek to kind of remove what they deemed as problematic, excessively costly, or so-called backwards practices from Korean families. I actually think that they sought out ways to put Confucian rituals to work on behalf of the Japanese Empire. And they wanted to remake Korea's Confucian culture in ways that promoted ideas like a shared East Asian morality, as well as foster loyalty to an expanding and multi-ethnic Japanese empire. And so a couple questions are going to ground our discussion for today. So I want to ask questions like, what exactly did it mean for the Japanese colonial state to promulgate the guidelines on ritual practice? And what exactly did the government general seek to achieve, and why? And what do these colonial ritual reforms tell us about kind of the broader, bigger story of cultural transformation in Korea under Japanese rule? And so I'd like to share just a couple examples from my research that start to get at these different questions. And so the anchor for today's discussion is the guidelines on ritual practice. In the first part of our discussion, we will be examining kind of the making of the guidelines to explore how this text really represented a staggering and astounding act of state power in Korea. And then we're actually going to shift gears a little bit to start looking at the text of the guidelines themselves. And we're going to talk about how the guidelines promoted Confucian marriage rites, but only in significantly altered forms in ways to bolster Japanese propagandistic claims. And when it came to funerals and ancestral veneration, we're going to see how the guidelines attempted to restructure customary kinship ties in ways that advance notions of a Japanese family state. And towards the very end of our discussion, we are going to return back to the stories of ordinary Koreans to think about how Koreans like the Ans were experiencing and responding to these kinds of unprecedented state intrusions in their everyday lives. And I want to say that examining ritual change actually offers us a way to think more deeply about what is actually a largely overlooked story about what happened to Confucianism, which was the paramount ideology of state and society in the Joseon dynasty. But what happened to it after the dynasty's abrupt end by Japanese annexation? And I hope that by tracing by going into the story through by way of rituals, we can actually gain a fuller understanding of really the many cultural continuities and discontinuities that were created by Japanese rule in Korea. So the precise origins of the guidelines, how the idea for this colonial ritual liturgy was first conceived and by whom, is actually somewhat murky. We don't have a lot of internal documents from the government general to help us pin this down with great precision. But one of the earliest glimpses that historians have into the making of the guidelines actually comes from the very top, from the diary of Governor General Ugaki Kazushige. He was a consummate diarist for nearly half a century, a period spanning 1902 to 1949. Ugaki actually penned his thoughts almost daily or sometimes multiple times a day. He wrote on things like the dangers of radical leftist thought, the establishment of Manchukuo, Japan's impending military conflict with China. And on July 16, 1933, Governor General Ugaki actually wrote on the issue of Korean ritual practices. He wrote, quote, "By no means should rituals be taken lightly, and Confucian family rites needed to become, quote, simple and solemn." Well, in Ugaki's mind, it appears that the guidelines would take the form of an existing textual genre, ritual manuals. Especially during the Joseon dynasty, primers based on Neo-Confucian scholar Jushi's famous text Family Rites proliferated in elite Korean households. Korean literati compiled texts like Guide to the Four Rites, which we see here, Essentials of Funerary Rites, collected commentaries on family rites, and these texts issued step-by-step instructions on the all-important Confucian family rites. And when Japanese annexation abruptly ended the Joseon dynasty, ritual manuals not only persisted in Korea, in Korean society, but they actually became more capacious as a textual genre. And there were new texts that were becoming in vogue, texts produced by different groups like Korean religious groups, as well as nationalist organizations. And to create the guidelines, Ugaki actually first turned to a very specific organization called the Central Council, or the Chungchuan or Chusuin in Japanese. And this group was comprised largely of wealthy landowners and former government officials. And it represented really the sole advisory body, Korean advisory body to the colonial state. And admittedly, the Central Council actually had very few duties at its inception. Many Koreans actually derided, made fun of this group as, quote, a nursing home for colonial sympathizers. But its responsibilities actually began to expand incrementally during the 1910s and 20s. The Central Council would typically meet once or twice a year to offer thoughts on matters of state concern. Of course, these were matters that the state dictated that they discuss. It was also a key contributor to colonial knowledge production. They were compiling prolific studies on Korean history, society, and culture, including Confucian family rites. And on July 18, 1933, just days after Ugaki's quite cryptic diary entry, the Central Council met for its 14th conference. At the behest of the Governor General, council members conferred on what colonial ritual reforms could or should look like. And in the beginning, the conference fielded a cacophony of different kinds of proposals. Some were saying that there needed to be greater restraint in the carrying out of weddings. Others were saying that the duration of the traditional funeral rites, which would take 3 years, should be cut short in a significant way. And others were saying that ancestral veneration happened too often, and we needed to streamline the frequency with which this particular ceremony took place. And the government general tasked 2 separate subcommittees within the Central Council to help compile the guidelines. The first was called the Governance Research Committee. And this committee was created in June 1933 with a mandate to study the most important questions facing the colonial state. And one of its very first jobs was to study ritual practices. The second committee that was also supposed to help with this process was the Evaluation Committee for the Guidelines on Ritual Practice. And they were supposed to serve a review function. So once a draft was completed, they were supposed to take a look and confer. And in theory, the Central Council, the whole body, was supposed to have one last opportunity to read the draft proposal before the government general promulgated it. Members of the Central Council were keenly aware of the magnitude of the task that was being placed before them. If we take a close look at their internal minutes, there's actually mixed sentiments about what they were being asked to do. This idea of being asked to make a single state-issued ritual standard for all Koreans. Some counselors, as might be expected, voiced enthusiastic support. Quote, in every country and age, one council member insisted, it was only proper to adopt state rituals, unquote. But not everyone had these kind of rosy views about top-down, state-issued ritual reform. A number of council members expressed hushed apprehension, and they called for a more inclusive, deliberative, culturally sensitive process for compiling the guidelines. And these misgivings about letting the state dictate what ritual reform should take place really proved quite prescient. At the end of the day, the Central Council was just an advisory body. It remained subordinate to the government general, and it had no decision-making power. And it's actually unclear the extent to which members of the Central Council were shaping the different versions of the guidelines that were even being proposed. In February 1934, when the Governance Research Committee was still actually supposed to be deliberating over the guidelines, they actually received from the government general a fully formed first draft of the guidelines for them to review. And the Evaluation Committee barely had a chance to do the same. And during the subsequent revision process that followed, a process in which the text of the guidelines actually doubled in length, council members actually didn't formally convene at all. And so we can surmise that it was actually government authorities who had final say over precisely what the guidelines would include. In the end, the process of creating the guidelines actually concluded relatively swiftly in November 1934, just over a year after Ugaki's initial diary entry. The government general promulgated its first ritual manual. The guidelines included over 100 clauses on weddings, funerals, and ancestral veneration. And the full text of the guidelines was published in nearly every newspaper in the peninsula, alongside an official statement from Ugaki himself. And the Governor General emphasized the stakes of colonial ritual reforms could not be higher. In his view, he said that the very welfare of the people, societal development, and national flourishing, these all hinged on the success of the guidelines. But of course, these are official discourses, right? And we're going to start peeling back all the layers of Ugaki's statement to think about what was really at stake for the government general in implementing these changes. November 23rd, 1934 was a brisk and sunny day in Gangseok County, South Pyongan province. It was actually perfect weather for an afternoon wedding. By 2 o'clock, the sanctuary at Gochang Church was full of guests. Over 3,000 had gathered from near and far. And when the wedding march began to play, all eyes turned back towards the church entrance. A bride wearing a traditional ceremonial garb walked solemnly down the aisle. And not long after, an identically clad bride soon followed suit. And another, until finally all 10 brides reached the altar, where 10 grooms in matching blue robes stood waiting. Theirs was a group wedding. And when the minister called the names of each bride and groom in turn, they together made simultaneous vows of lifelong devotion. And here are the two images that were taken from that day. If you can see from the right, it was quite a spectacle, especially for people who couldn't find their seats inside. I want to suggest that this unusual wedding offers us a glimpse into colonial interventions into marriage rights. So officials didn't actually orchestrate this wedding. It was actually a lay church leader who first came up with the idea for a group wedding, which by all accounts could have been the very first group wedding in Korea. Because it was supposed to be this unconventional and also less costly alternative that would actually be a church fundraiser for a badly needed church building. But county administrators in Gangseok County actually did stipulate one provision, the ceremonial attire that we see here. What the couples wore would have actually been just as striking to people who sat in church that day as the very number of brides and grooms. And that's because after nearly 50 years after the introduction of Protestantism to Korea, Western attire had become synonymous with church weddings and customary robes with Confucian weddings. And this was even true in rural places like Gangseok County, where we might not see as much of a Western cultural influence overall. And by insisting that these 10 brides and grooms wear these traditional vestments, local colonial bureaucrats were imparting a distinctly quote-unquote Confucian look to an otherwise Christian ceremony. And this is a theme that we'll see kind of throughout the rest of our discussion today. The co-optation of Confucian traditions would actually become a key feature of the guidelines. So what exactly did the guidelines entail with regard to weddings? Well, a dominant colonial refrain was modernization. The guidelines might have followed the general schema of a traditional Confucian wedding, but it also demanded really sweeping changes to existing customs. Things like astrological information to determine the compatibility of a bride and groom would no longer be allowed. The bride's family would schedule the wedding based on their own convenience, as opposed to specific auspicious days that a diviner would suggest. And the groom's family would also refrain from sending excessively costly gifts to the bridal family. And drawing from longstanding and really racialized colonial rhetoric against supposed Korean backwardness, officials insisted that such changes were necessary to sweep away whatever remnants that existed of, quote, bygone primitive times. Well, by the 1920s, the colonial officials were actually hardly the first ones to critique traditional Confucian weddings in Korea. Long before the promulgation of the guidelines, marriage rites had become sites for diverse aspirations for a modern Korean nation. And cosmopolitan Western-style church weddings were actually proliferating among Protestant and non-Protestant youth alike. And this is a picture from 1920. This is a very kind of stereotypical Protestant wedding at the time. And by the 1920s, Protestant nuptials actually earned the moniker, quote, new weddings, while their traditional counterparts simply became old weddings. And we can see on this kind of editorial here of all the different changes that were being symbolized in the late 1920s and 30s. And if you can see over here in the red box, there is a stark contrast between these kind of quote unquote old weddings and new weddings that Korean youth were thinking of. And colonial authorities were actually well aware of these kind of rival alternatives to the rituals that they were proposing. And they certainly didn't approve. Officials actually reserved their sharpest critique for what they called so-called new weddings, which is of course Western-style church weddings. On the one hand, the guidelines were recognizing Koreans' prerogative to carry out religious wedding ceremonies. So Shinto shrines, Buddhist temples, and Christian churches in that order were recognized as appropriate wedding venues. At the same time, the guidelines really included a number of not very subtle critiques against Western-style weddings. They were critiquing their supposed wastefulness, frivolity, and cultural incongruity with Korean customs. And the guidelines further suggested that only a small group of people should even be allowed to carry out religious ceremonies. Really, only true believers should be allowed, at a time when the majority of Koreans actually didn't have a formal religious affiliation at all. So they were basically saying only a small subset, maybe 2% of the Korean population should have these kind of cosmopolitan new weddings, and everyone else should really just follow the colonial guidelines on ritual practice. But officials did actually more than simply modify existing Confucian marriage rites. They're actually creating new ones too. In January 1937, the government general announced its intention to open the Gyeonghagwan as a public wedding venue. And during the Joseon dynasty, the Gyeonghagwan had actually been known as the Seonggyungwan, which was the official National Academy of Confucian Learning. And this was where the brightest sons of elite families were trained for civil service. And the colonial state said, well, now this space could be repurposed, reimagined for the masses. And so as long as couples were willing to comply with the guidelines, they were supposed to gain access to the main lecture hall, as well as whatever ceremonial attire and furnishings that they might need. And all this was also supposed to be available for the cheap price of 10 yen. And certain aspects of this Gyeonghagwan wedding actually bore little resemblance at all to traditional Confucian weddings. Historically, the Seonggyunggan wasn't just a place of learning, it was a place for venerating Confucius, for Confucian sages. The main lecture hall where weddings were supposed to take place was actually located directly across the courtyard from another building, which was called the Daesongjeon. And this was actually the highest ranking Confucian shrine in Korea. And this was where spirit tablets of Confucius and other Korean sages were venerated and honored every year. Twice a year, Gyeongwon officials would gather, just like we see here, to perform special ceremonies in their memory. But now, according to the colonial state, this space, just like the main lecture hall, would also become open to the public for the very first time. So if the traditional Confucian wedding ceremony concluded at the home of the groom, where the bride and groom would announce their union to the ancestors of the groom, bride and grooms at the Gyeongwon wedding would actually end their ritual at the Confucian shrine, and they would bow before a portrait of Confucius. So I do want to pause here for a moment to reflect on some of these kind of bizarre, seemingly confounding changes that we are witnessing in Korea. Colonial officials are calling for modernizing ritual practices, but they were vehemently against Western-style practices that were in vogue among Koreans. And officials were throwing their support behind Confucian rituals, but only in significantly altered, or more accurately, reinvented ways, in these kind of hyper-Confucian or neo-traditional forms. And I think to understand why these specific changes were taking place, we actually need to go back and think about the historical context. And I want to say that this kind of valorization, celebration of a kind of strange form of Confucian rituals were a reflection of broader shifts in colonial policies. The government general had a long history of selectively promoting Confucianism in Korea. So for decades, they were hand-selecting specific teachings like respect for social hierarchy or loyalty to the sovereign, even as they were diminishing the status and function of a lot of different Confucian institutions. And actually, Confucianism became even more indispensable to the colonial state after 1931, after the invasion of northeast China. In the face of mounting international backlash, policymakers across the empire were actually turning to Confucianism as propaganda for Japan's continued territorial expansion. They were highlighting Confucianism as a common cultural heritage, this kind of common glue that would bind together the East against the West. And they were also insisting that Japan stood as the proper defender and custodian of this shared heritage. And so from this backdrop, we can see that it makes a lot of sense for the colonial state to be making these changes in these particular ways. So shifting gears, I want to tell a story. There was a story about an eminent Confucian scholar who had 3 disciples. And it so happened that one day, all 3 disciples were supposed to carry out ancestral veneration for their respective grandparents. And all 3 disciples actually went to their teacher, this eminent Confucian scholar, for advice. The first one asked if it was okay to skip his grandmother's Chesa observance, ancestral observance, because a woman in their household had just given birth, making their home unsuitable for this ceremonial practice. The second disciple had a similar quandary. He asked if he also could skip his grandfather's ceremony because his dog had just given birth, rendering his home similarly improper for these rites. And then there was a third disciple who made his pitch. So he said, well, his family cow had also given birth, but he wondered if possibly they could make an exception. If ceremonial purification could take place, was it possible for his grandfather's ancestral ceremony to happen anyway, since it represented the most important of all Confucian rites, symbolizing filial piety? The teacher said yes to all 3 questions. And so this story of the 3 disciples and their teacher appeared as a part of a text called An Explanation of Rites, which was an authorized annotated commentary to the guidelines on ritual practice. And the crux of this story of the three disciples and their teacher was supposed to kind of rest in the teacher's kind of curious sense of consistency to three different requests, right? So according to the text, the teacher said yes to all three disciples because true rituals were supposed to be based in sincerity. And so the first two disciples kind of lack of filial piety, trying to weasel their way out of ancestral veneration, meant that any possible ritual they performed would be utterly meaningless. And it was only this third disciple's kind of true, sincere desire to honor his grandfather that would compensate for any kind of ceremonial irregularity. But I want to say that the Confucian scholars' kind of response wasn't the only thing that was strange about this story. So the story actually makes it seem as if the decision to hold or not hold these ancestral observances rested solely in the three disciples and three individuals. The text never talks about any brothers or cousins or uncles who would have been really crucial participants in these rituals. And I want to say that this omission in this authorized text was entirely by design, and it's also a theme that we'll continue to see in the rest of the guidelines. And this is because during the Joseon Dynasty, Confucian rituals were not just these embodiments of moral values like filial piety. They actually also played really important social functions. And historians like Martina Deutgler talked about how they facilitated the creation of a patrilineal society that emphasized descent just through the father's line. And ancestral veneration played really important roles in the creation of this patrilineal society. Elite Yangban families were duty-bound to venerate 4 generations of agnatic or paternal ancestors. And this duty to honor 4 generations actually gave rise to the basic unit of Korean kinship, which was called the 당내, which we can see kind of a schema here. Members of the 당내 included all male descendants of the same great-great-grandfather. And all of these descendants were supposed to collectively gather for memorials to their shared ancestors. And over time, as these gatherings repeated over and over, these ceremonies were supposed to cement a sense of identity and solidarity among all of the members on this family tree. Funerals also played similar functions also. They also served to reinforce patrilineal kinship bonds. All members of the family tree that we just saw actually had obligations to observe mourning for one another. And a key component of this mourning obligation was wearing special mourning attire. And the details of what exactly someone wore and for how long, they were all predetermined. They're predetermined by a set of rules called the 5 grades of mourning. And the first and really the strictest grade of mourning was reserved for the eldest son, and typically he would be wearing unhemmed sackcloth for 3 years. And in contrast, the 5th grade of mourning was much lighter, and it stipulated sackcloth for just 3 months. And these differentiated mourning garb was not only supposed to remind everyone of the relationship to one another, but also remind them of where exactly they fit on the family tree, who they were as members of the 당내. And the guidelines stood to substantively alter the composition and function of traditional patrilineal kinship. First, the guidelines proposed to circumscribe 당내 membership by recommending that all families commemorate just 2 generations of ancestors rather than 4. And so basically a considerable number of family members would just be lopped off from this important family tree. And second, the guidelines stipulated that this pared down group of kin actually get together less frequently than before, and they were only supposed to gather on the death anniversary of their shared ancestors and just one single traditional holiday of their choice, as opposed to a whole suite of possible occasions. And also, the guidelines really diminished the obligations that 당내 members owed one another. the text restricted mourning garb to just parents, spouses, and children of the deceased. And everyone else, so all other kin, were simply supposed to don a black armband on top of ordinary clothes. And just as a side, that's also typically the mourning attire today in Korea, and that's a totally different story. Okay. These concerns about patrilineal kinship loomed large for colonial officials. It was not an accident that the guidelines were having this effect on patrilineal kinship. Since the earliest years of Japanese rule, officials actually viewed these traditional patrilineal ties as a political problem. On the most basic level, it was thought to be an impediment to colonial assimilation. This expansive Korean understanding of family stood in stark contrast with a much narrower Japanese understanding of kinship based on simply the household or the ie. The government general required that all families register as households, so according to this Japanese understanding of kinship. But actually, when it came to adjudicating family matters, so things like marriage, inheritance, succession, they didn't just look at households. They had this kind of pluralistic legal system where Japanese settlers would be subject to the Meiji Civil Code, and Koreans were subject to a different system. So they were subject to customary law, which continued to define kinship as these kind of expanded patrilineal networks. And this pluralistic system was only supposed to be temporary. It was just a stopgap measure, but it continued to persist into the 1930s. And officials found patrilineal kinship problematic for other reasons too. During the 1930s, government administrators were increasingly drawing attention to the insularity, the inward focus of these patrilineal ties. They were particularly looking at these communities called single lineage villages, where all members of a particular village, they're all family, they're all patrilineal kin. Colonial ethnographers were producing prolific studies of this one type of village, which actually comprised 20% of all villages at the time. And these ethnographers were alarmed by what they found. They claimed that villagers were entirely consumed by lineage priorities, things like performing ancestral veneration, or maintaining ancestral grave sites, or compiling genealogies, which was actually the largest genre of text in Korea. Colonial officials became convinced that residents of lineage villages, and perhaps Koreans writ large, were only thinking about their own blood relations, their own kin, and not enough about public or really colonial concerns. And these colonial critiques against traditional kinship would only intensify with war mobilization. In 1938, just months after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a propagandist named Hyun Young-sup published his manifesto, which was titled "The Path That Koreans Should Take." And Hyun insisted that the very war readiness of the peninsula hinged on Koreans' understanding of family. Korean familism, which is the term that he used, hindered the cultivation of proper imperial subjects. And Hyun hypothesized that if Koreans were to fall in battle on behalf of the Japanese Empire, they would do so with their thoughts still fixed on their own family, their parents, their spouses, their children. And the remedy was supposed to be a wholly different kind of kinship. He said that Koreans needed to adopt Japanese familism, which demanded filial devotion to the Japanese emperor, who was supposed to be the father sovereign of all imperial subjects. And Hyun Young-sup insisted that only by embracing Japanese familism would Koreans sacrifice themselves for the emperor, as the Japanese did, with shouts of banzai to His Majesty the Emperor. The guidelines of ritual practice really form part of broader colonial efforts to restructure Korean society in preparation for war. patrilineal kinship itself became increasingly problematic for the government general, as were ritual ceremonies that continued to reinforce and perpetuate these ties. And it was really in this context that colonial authorities made it an urgent priority to remake Confucian ancestral veneration as well as funerals. The guidelines were actively undermining traditional patrilineage to make space for an alternative emperor-centric understanding of kinship. And I want to say that these efforts were actually a precursor to even more radical wartime policies in years to come. The most notorious of which was the name change campaign in 1940, where Korean families were forced to adopt Japanese surnames. So I want to return to the stories of ordinary Koreans. On March 23rd, 1935, a 28-year-old intellectual from South Chungcheong province headed to the local village primary school. The school was hosting a public lecture on the guidelines on ritual practice, and the head of his township had personally requested his attendance. And Choi Byung-chul was actually precisely the kind of person that colonial officials wanted to recruit. His family may have had relatively modest economic means, but Choi actually had sterling social credentials. He hailed from the illustrious Gyeongju Choi clan. He received a thorough training in the Confucian classics, and he also took various leadership roles in his community. And local officials viewed Choi and people like him as critical partners to promote colonial ritual reforms. And not long after this lecture at the primary school, Choi Byung-chul was actually appointed to his township's association for implementing the guidelines. And this is recorded in his voluminous personal diary. Securing compliance with the guidelines was a monumental task for the government general. The very act of imposing a single ritual standard for all Koreans reflected officials' quite grandiose, quixotic ambitions for transforming traditional customs. Colonial authorities insisted that the responsibility of enacting the guidelines, though, did not rest with the state alone. It would be a joint endeavor with officials and ordinary individuals, individuals just like Choi Byung-chul. And in theory, government administrators and community leaders would deploy various strategies of, quote, moral suasion to convince Korean families to relinquish their time-honored practices. But of course, reality is a lot different than the theory. Colonial officials were seeking out strategic, although fundamentally unequal partners to help implement the guidelines. In urban centers, groups of educated professionals and members of a growing middle class were helping drum up support for state-backed ritual prescriptions. And in the countryside, where the majority of Koreans lived, colonial authorities were launching an even greater flurry of initiatives to co-opt Korean cooperation. School teachers were arranging for special demonstrations on proper ritual performance, while local officials were hosting lectures and roundtables targeting students' parents and grandparents, especially those from elite Yangban backgrounds. And colonial propaganda was only touting the supposed rapid success of these various initiatives. Government reports quantifying the outcomes of the guidelines really became so prolific that they were a virtual genre of its own. According to one government survey, between November 1934 and March 1935, so the first 6 months after the promulgation of the guidelines, approximately 2,500 families across the peninsula were performing their rituals according to the guidelines. And according to another government survey published for the next 6 months, approximately 31,000 people were following the guidelines, which would have amounted to an astonishing increase of over 1,000%. It goes without saying that we should approach these numbers with a hefty dose of skepticism, considering colonial surveys were often greatly exaggerated. These triumphalist narratives of ritual transformation were actually concealing colonial authorities' reliance on quite heavy-handed enforcement strategies. Officials were increasingly turning to quasi-governmental organizations like the Association for Implementing the Guidelines, which Choi Byung-chae, we saw, had himself joined. These organizations were proliferating in villages, townships, and counties across the peninsula. And they were keeping really close tabs on ritual ceremonies under their jurisdiction. They were actually sending representatives to appear at these individual ritual ceremonies. So if you had a wedding, a funeral, ancestral marriage, you'd have these members at your doorstep keeping tabs on what families were doing. Some organizations were actually adopting punitive disciplinary measures against infractions. So some people might be being fined anywhere from 1 to 20 yen. And just to give a reference point, 1 yen was probably what an average laborer was earning at the time. And so it is quite an astounding sum for a lot of farming families. Colonial authorities were also relying on violence to secure compliance with the guidelines. If we jog our memories, the guidelines only permitted close kin, so parents, spouses, children, to wear the specialized mourning attire, and for only a maximum of 14 days, as opposed to the longest duration according to custom, which is 3 years. And those who were violating these stipulations that the colonial state put in place risked what Koreans called a baptism of ink. Officials were regularly patrolling public spaces like markets, and anyone suspected of wearing mourning garb in violation of the guidelines were smeared or splashed with dark ink. In one case, a man not only fell victim to this dreaded form of public humiliation, but he was actually also severely beaten for wearing customary white mourning attire. And he actually spoke to a Korean newspaper, and he made the statement, quote, "This incident was exceedingly excessive. I am furious and cannot suppress my sense of injustice," unquote. And enforcing guidelines entailed other forms of violence. Colonial authorities went as far as to confiscate and desecrate Korean families' ritual paraphernalia. In April 1935, local police in Eulching County in North Gyeongsang Province actually went door to door looking for what were called spirit seats. And spirit seats, you can see a picture of, this is a shop selling spirit seats. And these were really critical elements to the traditional funerary ritual ceremonies. And the guidelines stipulated that Korean families were supposed to remove them after the first death anniversary. But a lot of families chose to ignore that, and they would keep them up for several years afterwards. And so the local police actually went door to door for a month, and they confiscated and likely destroyed 275 spirit seats from the county. The guidelines remained deeply unpopular among Koreans. In May 1935, the Mail Shinbo, which was actually a newspaper aligned with the colonial state, reported on a Confucian scholar named Lee Ki-hyun. Yi was apparently unconvinced by what colonial officials were saying about all the benefits of the guidelines on ritual practice. And as far as he was concerned, these prescriptions were corrupting the 3 bonds and 5 virtues, the very foundations of Confucian ethics. And so Yi took it upon himself to pen an appeal to Confucian organizations across the peninsula. And to the great alarm of local officials, Yi actually urged all fellow Confucian scholars, so literati, to join him in active opposition to the guidelines. and actually even community leaders, leaders who are responsible for implementing the guidelines were not necessarily model exemplars for its implementation. If we return to the example of Choi Byung-chae, the intellectual from South Chungcheong province, even he was not the exemplar that officials hoped he would be. In his diary, he has a lot of ambivalence about the guidelines, especially about ancestral veneration. And his diary entry from April 1935 noted that he observed Cold Foods Day, a traditional holiday, by performing gravesite rites for 4 generations of ancestors, so 2 generations too many. And he did this actually until 1944, so just 1 year before the end of Japanese rule. And so we can imagine that if someone who's supposed to tell people to observe the guidelines were doing this, we can imagine that many other Koreans, no doubt, were doing the same. So the guidelines, I think, embody the reach and limits of colonial power during the wartime mobilization years. I think it reflected the wildly expansive aspirations of the government in general, aspirations to fundamentally transform Confucian family rights, aspirations to extend the reach of the colonial state deep into domestic spaces and people's everyday lives. The guidelines designated ritual ceremonies as a domain for state oversight and intervention in ways that actually even dwarfed Joseon precedents to do the same. At the same time, the guidelines also had very real limitations. Colonial ritual prescriptions faced widespread resistance among Koreans. Officials had to resort to violence and coercion to implement what they wanted. And in 1940, they actually issued an even more stringent revised standards on weddings and funerals. And the guidelines actually continued to shape Korea long after the end of Japanese rule. And this was especially the case in South Korea. Park Chung-hee, the dictator best known for bringing about the so-called miracle on the Han River, issued the family guidelines on ritual practice in 1969 with virtually the identical name as the colonial predecessor. In 1973, just 1 year after he declared martial law in South Korea, non-compliance with his family guidelines was actually criminalized. Today, we have yet another state standard called the Wholesome Family Guidelines on Ritual Practice, though it does not it's not actually enforced by the state, even though it does exist on the books. And we can see a pamphlet of the Park Chung-hee's family guidelines. South Koreans continue to grapple with what rituals could and should look like in contemporary society. Some saying that we should get rid of them entirely, often using discourses that are really quite reminiscent of what colonial officials were using to erode traditional Confucian rites. So I think in this kind of moment in time, I think it's really important for us to keep in mind this longer history of ritual reforms in the peninsula. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Jun. Now I'll invite Professor Jun to please stay here, and I will go ahead and field any questions before maybe to give the audience a moment to formulate their thoughts, collect their thoughts, and pose a question. Maybe I can just maybe kickstart the conversation. Professor Jin, I'm very deeply impressed at how you're able to highlight this other repertoire of colonial control, this intervention and reinvention in rights, something as basic as rights, pushing this neo-Confucianism onto the most basic level of society. So thank you very much. I guess what I wanted to ask you is just taking a step back is that there's a lot of interest in Korea these days, in Korean studies, and there's a lot of research going on. And I would love to hear what are some of the most promising fields, promising developments you've seen in Korean studies, and how does your research basically speak to those developments? And then afterwards, we can probably get some questions from audiences.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Tai, for the question. I think we are in a moment where we have the real luxury that Korean studies, Korean history is a growing field. It wasn't necessarily the case when I first started studying Korean history. And I think there are lots of different kind of emerging pathways that are happening. I think trends in the field that are reflective of broader kind of disciplinary shifts in history. So you see new ways of understanding modern Korea. So whether it's looking at the environment or looking at the growth of militarism, or I think in my case, really kind of re-interrogating the nature of state power. And I think this is also work that other folks are starting to engage with as well. So to give a little bit of context, especially in the past 20 years, the idea of state power was, colonial state power was a concern of many scholars, but people had moved beyond this binary of repression versus resistance. And they're thinking about modern technologies of state power that is pervasive. So if you're thinking about culture or a cultural imperialism, or thinking about modernity, I think are kind of dominant ways of thinking about it. And I think the pendulum has kind of swung back because this idea that power is everywhere, we can ask, well, where is power exactly? Where do we find moments of resistance or autonomy? If power is everywhere, is power nowhere? And so I think scholars, myself included, are thinking about, well, in the realm of everyday life, in places like ritual practices or elsewhere, how do we concretely see the mechanisms of state power, where it's reaching, where it can't reach? And I think it's also important to remember also that violence happened, state violence existed. And I think that with this kind of notions of modern technology, it's a really important intervention, but I think we also need to think about the experiences of ordinary people as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jun. Now I'd like to invite some questions from the audiences. Any questions? Okay, well, Professor Thornton.
Well, I mean, I think I'm seeing you later, so I don't want to take up room if there are.
Oh, go ahead, take up the time, please.
Okay, I will fill up the time. Careful what you wish for. Thank you. This is such a fascinating talk. I teach Japanese history here. And so, of course, my question is about Japan. I noticed on one of the slides that kind of the framing of these rites was often the idea of improving lifestyles, which of course is the exact same name of the movement that's virtually contemporary in Japan. And I guess I was just wondering, as you think about this as an expression of colonial power, how might you situate it against kind of the domestic version of this policy, which is also kind of a central urban state going into the countryside of Japan and getting people to, not Confucian rites, but getting them to change whatever superstitions that the state sees that as. Obviously, you mentioned kind of the post-war examples in Korea, but similar efforts in mainland China, all over the region to kind of stamp out old traditions. I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more, not so much about why this is or isn't colonial, but how you see it kind of relating to other sort of modern projects of improving particularly rural life.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that wonderful question. I think there are kind of strong and really important resonances between what's happening in the peninsula and in metropolitan Japan. Or I guess rural Japan is where a lot of these lifestyle reform campaigns are happening. And in fact, almost identical kinds of rural lifestyle reform projects are happening in Korea in the 30s. And so, which is why a lot of historians of Korea would say, well, this is actually just like the one in Japan, which was really about creating modern national subjects. So everyday life is political, and it's supposed to create a certain kind of subjectivity, a certain kind of rural farm or idealized kind of citizen. And so, which is why a lot of people have really paid attention to economizing. So make your lifestyle more rational, more economical, which was what a lot of farmers were being told. But I think that this is certainly happening. But if we only kind of think about what's kind of modernizing about these changes, we forget what's colonial about these changes. And I think that we have to kind of look kind of deeper beyond the economizing rhetoric to think about, well, what are the kind of substantive ways in which these changes are happening? And if it's, yes, these rights might be cheaper to kind of perform, but what else are they doing? Are they becoming more neo-Confucian, right? And so, and if that's the case, why? And I think that that will help us understand what's colonial about this project and what's different between what's happening in Korea versus rural Japan.
Forcing changing your name, so Shikaime, and also breaking traditional notions of Korean family. That's pretty.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, that's a
Yeah.
colonial difference, I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah, no, but Michael is right. I mean, this in China, this is something happening
Mm-hmm.
too with the New Life movement. Thank you very much. I think I saw a hand back there. Was it Ashley? Did you have a question? Go ahead, please.
I think it was partially answered in the question of what differentiates the colonial changes versus just other changes that were happening. So I kind of forgot it's a question I was gonna ask, but I think it was clarified just now. Also, I was just wondering what inspired you to start researching this topic and other things you might have discovered throughout that you found interesting.
Yeah, actually, believe it or not, I wasn't interested in rights when I first started this project. I am a historian of religion, and so I was actually I was a grad student it was really serendipitous. I was taking a class with my advisor on visuality in modern Asia, and I came across an image of Protestant weddings, like the one I showed, and it was arresting. It was really striking because it was certainly Western, but also not. It had all of these Korean elements. And I wanted to learn more about these kinds of practices. And the more I dug, the more I realized that this isn't just a story about kind of cultural hybridity or Westernization. It's a story about religion. And believe it or not, the Western weddings were extremely controversial, also among Korean nationalists who were saying, well, we need an alternative from Confucian rites, but we don't want that either. What can we do instead? And so I also realized that it didn't just involve Korean interlocutors, but also the Japanese colonial state, who also intervened pretty significantly in ways that perhaps might be somewhat unique in the Japanese empire. So I have a hunch that because Korea was so neo-Confucian, first of all, and also because there were all of these debates that happened in the 10s and 20s, that Korea became this kind of prime ground where these ritual reforms in particular could become a project of the colonial state in ways that we don't necessarily see in Taiwan or in Manchukuo, or not to the same degree or in kind of systematic degree.
Gordana.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little more about resistance? You talk about also that, one way of understanding is the resistance, and it's also opportunity. If people are meeting together, they can also resist to the Japanese state.
Yeah. So I think in terms of resistance, one kind of hindrance for the colonial state was the fact that some of these rituals, like ancestral veneration, took place at night. And so it's really hard to get, colonial officials to be kind of going door to door at night. They don't always know the ritual calendar, even though these local associations were supposed to actually keep track. And I think the fact is, even for people who are supposed to implement these guidelines, they were still members of their communities, right? There are still people who were, a neighbor, they had neighbors, they had family members. And so I think there's also considerable reluctance on the part of these agents of the colonial state in terms of implementing. And I think by and large, when people could get away with it, they simply did rituals the way that they wanted to. Although I think it really depends on specific cases where some police might be more zealous than others. I've seen anecdotal accounts where some rural residents in particular felt such a strain of this kind of constant surveillance and intervention that if they had the means, so wealthy owners would say, actually forget this, I'm just gonna move to the city, because in the city, there doesn't seem to be as much control and people seem to be having more kind of, they're able to live as they want to. And the other, I guess the other, going back to the earlier question about economization, the other kind of suspicion I had that this wasn't simply about economizing was the fact that if you look at cities, a lot of urban elites were having lavish ceremonies that they would invite colonial officials to attend. So they would have these like grand weddings at, you know, like lavish hotels. And so the colonial state, perhaps even Ugaki himself, didn't really have a problem going to them in the cities. It's really a problem of kind of controlling the countryside. And so I think there's this colonial dimension there as well.
I'm curious to know, thank you for your talk, it was very interesting. Were there a certain amount of intermarriages between Japanese and Koreans?
So especially during the 30s and 40s, it was certainly something that the colonial state in theory wanted to encourage, although it was not something that Japanese settlers community members themselves thought highly of, because they want to protect their own privileges and their own cultural identity. And so the actual, I mean, it did happen, but the actual number of intercultural marriages were quite few in number. So it's a really small percentage of overall marriages.
I saw a hand in the back. Yes, Unsung, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to, you spoke a little bit about like the rites that particularly like the firstborn son would partake in. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about daughters and mothers, and particularly like women that participated, but also perhaps deviated.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So thinking about the role of women, well, these rituals, especially ancestral veneration, they wouldn't happen without women, right? So technically, because Neo-Confucian teachings really gave a marginal role to women in terms of the rituals themselves, and this is actually in contrast during the Goryeo dynasty, which preceded the Joseon dynasty, where women were actually active participants in these ancestral veneration. But that was not a patrilineal society, right? It was a different kind of, it was a different society. Women have more rights. They had higher social status. And so, but their women's kind of crucial role in these ancestral rites was the food preparation. And so it's kind of an enormous undertaking. So it's a lot of kind of specialized foods that you need to, like a lot of training since you're a young woman to learn how to prepare. I actually only learned after my grandmother passed that she was someone who had this deep knowledge and taught all of my dad's cousins how to prepare these intricate meals. And so women were integral to this. An interesting caveat is that as war mobilization progresses, the colonial state actually thinks of ways to intervene in ancestral veneration even more. They say, how do we make a connection between Chesa, ancestral veneration, and Shinto shrines? Because that's also ancestral veneration. We're venerating the emperor's ancestors. And so they would say, well, women they're like deeply pious. They should take more of a role. They should take care of their like household Shinto shrines. And the kind of corollary would have been, although I haven't really seen it in the sources, that women perhaps should be taking more of a role in ancestral rites too, in order to make this connection with women's participation in Shinto shrines. Women's participation is also one of the reasons why a lot of young Korean people in South Korea today are saying down with Confucian rites because it's so onerous to women's labor. My solution would be, well, have the men participate, have them cook as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I saw another. Yes, thank you.
Sorry. It was a very interesting talk. I have a question, is that how, like, I know that these are like colonial era rites and ritual practices that were, imposed in an attempt to really get like make like as an experiment to like give Koreans like kind of like more like like Japanese-ish like kind of culture and stuff. But like I wonder if any of these practices or guidelines prevail after the colonial era.
Yeah, so that's really interesting question. And I would say a lot of them, in fact, because the historical memory of where these recommendations, these prescriptions come from, they've largely been lost from memory. So even though to us, we can say, oh, there's a direct correlation between the guidelines on ritual practice and the family guidelines, for people who grew up in that era, they didn't see this connection because the South Korean government actively erased this connection. And for them, they were saying it's simply about modernization, about economization. And so a lot of the same prescriptions were actually kind of adopted wholesale. So things like you shouldn't venerate 4 generations of ancestors. You should only venerate 2 or perhaps even 1. So you have these kinds of recycling of these prescriptions. In some ways, you might think there are deviations. So the colonial guidelines allowed for religious diversity to an extent, but the family guidelines that Park Chung-hee promulgated didn't. So he said everyone has to do this, including if you're Buddhist or if you're Christian, it doesn't matter, everyone has to do this. And so I think, yeah, thinking about colonial legacies, it's troubling to think that there's not a lot of memory about how violent these prescriptions were and how easily they were adopted in South Korea, and they continue. And so a lot of these prescriptions are now just commonplace part of ritual culture in Korea.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for such a rich and fascinating talk. I'm so sorry that I came in a little bit late, but I am currently teaching Asian American Studies, and we, in our class, I see some of my students here, read Mary Pike Lee's My Odyssey, and in it she reflects on the experience of sort of witnessing colonialism from the position of the United States. I'm curious about how sort of the diaspora outside of Korea sort of understood these rights, understood the sort of like everyday implications of colonialism, and how that perhaps shifted, created frictions around sort of these religious conversations and also the conversations about rights, sort of that transnational dimension.
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. I feel like in terms of my knowledge of Asian American experiences and kind of historical memory, it's really just a case study of one. So it's just me. I'm not an expert on Asian American history, but I think that I think it would depend on individual families' experiences. So certainly for families who, and also religious backgrounds. So to give an example, I guess students who read Lost Names. So if you are a Christian and you didn't participate in Shinto shrine rites, it was because you didn't participate in ancestral rites, right? And so I think that Protestants were some of the first iconoclasts against Confucian traditions. And because of that, their experience of kind of, especially the late wartime years, especially if they refused to participate in some of these mobilizing campaigns, it's a bitter memory of colonial rule. And it also created kind of a, I think a sense of loss and trauma that certainly would have been carried over generations. But then we also know that a lot of these experiences of trauma, they're not often shared intergenerationally. And so, I think that's a really good question I would want to think more about. Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps one more question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So the question I kind of have is, so the Japanese colonial government promulgated these sort of ritual reforms in order to increase the utility of, say, the Korean society population during wartime with China. And I guess my question is, it sounds like they had to use pretty extensive and brutal methods in order to implement these reforms. So do you think that the costs of this sort of reform project sort of outweighed the benefit the Japanese colonial government even got from it? Do you think this is an inherently self-defeating policy due to the like sort of repressive methods required?
I think to answer that question, I think you have to have a baseline assumption that the colonial officials were thinking about a cost-benefit analysis at every turn. And I'm not sure that that's the case. And I think that oftentimes there were certain ideological agendas that were pushed to really their own detriment. So for instance, the ink smearing campaign was hated by everyone. It was actually part of a larger campaign against white clothing in general that preceded the guidelines. And Koreans were known as the people of white clothing. So everybody's ordinary clothes are white. And so whenever you stepped out, people would be there spraying ink on you, or sometimes going into your house and digging through your dressers to look for white clothing. And this was supposed to be to save housewives time and labor hand laundering these clothes. But was it really they weren't really saving people time, and this was a much reviled policy, but it persisted and it expanded to include mourning clothes, which would have been considered a real desecration. And so I think that's also colonialism, right? I mean, it's not just a cost-benefit analysis, and it's about power and control. And so I think in the case of the guidelines, it was, if we're thinking from in hindsight, it certainly was a not a effective policy. It didn't achieve what they wanted, and it was counter-effective. But I think we have to ask that about colonialism in general as well. Yeah.
Well, on that very uplifting note, thank you so much. I have a few announcements I want to make before I complete our event. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. First of all, we have our usual book raffle for the audience. If you are here, you are eligible automatically for raffle for these books. Normally, we would ask to give books away from who's written by the author, but Professor Jun's book is forthcoming, which all of you, I'm sure, will be looking forward to. So we are going to go ahead and give away the books that she had recommended. What was the title again?
It's Professor Nun's new book, Women in the Sky.
Women in the Sky, about labor and
Women's workers.
in contemporary South Korea, right? And it's won a lot of prizes.
Yeah, the James Palais Prize.
Palais Prize, yeah, it's pretty impressive. So we're gonna announce the winners pretty soon and give them away. And then once we give them away, we'll ask the winners to come up and hold the books and take a picture with Professor Jun, who recommended it. The other announcement that I also want to make is that we are going to have a few more Rethinking Korea series for the rest of this semester. The next one is going to be on Thursday, November 2nd, by the artist Hee-soo Kwon. She is going to have an exhibition, A Flower Strong in the Wind. And then the next one that we'll have the first one we'll have in the next semester will be on Wednesday, January 24th, with Professor Alina Kim. She is going to give a presentation entitled Demilitarized Ecologies, Making Peace with Nature Along the Korean DMZ. So she's an anthropologist. She'll be giving a very interesting and fascinating look at the environment in the demilitarized zone. All right. And then a final announcement relates to my students. For those of you who are here, there is a sheet out there. Just check your name off. All right. Do we have any winners for the books?
Oh, yes.
Go ahead and announce 3 names.
So first one is Han
Mu, are you here? Yay! Congratulations.
Second one, Alexei Kravchenko.
Alexis. Oh, where are you, Alexis? Oh, there you are. Right there. Yay!
I would like to assign the third one. Rachel Qing.
Rachel, oh, there you go. Oh, wow. Wonderful. So I'll invite the winners to please come up here. We'll take a photo really quickly. And then after the photo, if you want to ask Professor Jun some follow-up questions, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much. Thank you again. So all of you stand close to Professor Jun, hold up the book and smile.
All right, hello. Yeah, hold it up so I can see. Just a little bit. May I please?
Yeah.
We're also in
Perfect. Congratulations, graduating.
Great bus, yeah.
I
Congratulations. Yeah. I was,
I go to
Thank you for coming. Oh, does she?